You know that person at work who never chases anyone, never over-explains why they are unavailable, never lobbies for attention, and yet the moment a real decision needs to be made, every head in the room turns toward them first. No volume, no performance, no strategy you can name, just a way of taking up space that no one can quite put into words. Philosophers have been studying this exact pattern for centuries. There is a specific kind of person who never campaigns for their own importance. They do not argue for their relevance, do not perform effort, do not make sure you notice them working, and somehow, when something actually matters, everyone in the room already knows where to look. That consistency has been observed across centuries of human behavior, and it follows a logic that is almost never taught directly. Think about human relationships, the way a chess master thinks about the board. Every move, every word, every silence sends ripples far beyond the moment it happens. The people who understand the game know something that beginners spend years trying to learn. Real strength does not announce itself through constant offense. It lives in the control of space, in strategic patience, in the ability to hold tension without showing all your cards. This understanding has survived across cultures and centuries because it keeps proving itself true in every meaningful human encounter. The gap between those who have internalized these principles and those who keep ignoring them quietly determines the fate of their careers, their friendships, their closest relationships. We live in a world where instant response has become the default, where constant availability is treated as a virtue, and a strange paradox has formed inside that norm. The more accessible you make yourself, the less valuable you appear. There is something close to an unwritten law operating beneath the surface of human perception. Whatever is always available starts to lose its appeal. What is rare, what is selected, what has to be waited for, gains weight. This dynamic is not random. It is wired deep into the evolutionary psychology that shaped the species. For thousands of years, scarce resources determined survival, and the mental patterns that developed from that reality still quietly run in the background, shaping how people assign worth and desirability to what they encounter. Modern culture has handed you a compelling but quietly destructive story. The path to being valued, it says, runs through endless accommodation, total availability, and limitless generosity. But anyone who has followed that script all the way to its conclusion knows the bitter place it leads. Your sacrifices go unnoticed. Your effort becomes the baseline expectation. Your presence stops carrying any particular weight. You become the human equivalent of background noise, necessary in the way air conditioning is necessary, but never once considered. This false narrative has shaped entire generations into people who confuse submission with love, availability with worth, and compliance with respect. What changes everything here is not a technique. It is not something you perform for an audience or deploy strategically in a difficult conversation. It comes from a principle that has quietly guided leaders, artists, and visionaries across history. The ability to govern yourself is what makes it possible to influence anything else. When you learn to recognize your own value, to draw clear boundaries, to operate from a genuine internal center of gravity, something remarkable begins to happen. The outer world starts mirroring the inner shift. People who used to look past you begin reaching out with an urgency that would have seemed impossible before. That is not magic. That is applied psychology, moving with precision and intention. There is an uncomfortable truth that most people would rather not face. You were taught to believe that boundless kindness guarantees love, that perpetual availability secures loyalty, and that personal sacrifice always comes back to you as gratitude. These beliefs sound admirable on the surface, but they are also the walls of an invisible prison. Every time you say yes when you mean no, every moment you push your own needs aside for someone else, every hour you endure something intolerable in the hope of being appreciated, you are feeding a pattern that moves you further from the life that is actually yours. The pattern has a starting point, even if it is hard to locate precisely. At some stage, probably before you had language for it, you learned that being wanted and being useful were the same thing, that your place in a room was justified by what you contributed to it, not by the simple fact of being there. Nobody sat you down and explained this. It was absorbed through what got praised and what got ignored over enough years that it started to feel like fact. and facts do not get questioned. They just get lived. Human psychology runs on principles that directly contradict the assumptions you grew up with. Contrary to what you were taught, people do not treasure what costs them nothing. The brain is built to value what required effort, energy, and genuine investment to obtain. When those elements are absent, perceived value quietly disappears. This is why the person who accepts every extra task without question rarely gets promoted, while the one who holds clear limits tends to be treated as essential and irreplaceable. In personal relationships, this dynamic intensifies dramatically. The friend who is always there eventually stops being seen at all, not because they changed, but because constancy stopped registering as a choice. They became part of the assumed landscape of someone else's life. The way a window is part of a room, noticed only when something about it shifts. Someone who keeps a degree of mystery, who does not immediately pour out every emotional availability, who maintains private spaces in their life, creates a natural curiosity that keeps attention alive. This is not about playing with someone else's feelings, it is about honoring your own. The culture of constant availability has produced a generation of emotionally exhausted people whose identity has collapsed into an extension of other people's needs. You measure your self-worth by how fast someone responds, how often you get included, how intensely you feel appreciated at any given moment. You have handed your emotional well-being to factors you cannot control. And that dependence is not only unsustainable, it registers to the people who might otherwise value you as something quietly repelling. The architecture of modern distraction was not designed to calm you. It was designed to keep you checking, and you built a habit around it without noticing, scanning for signals that someone still considers you worth their time, measuring your worth in response speeds and reaction counts. The nervous system that was meant to protect you from real danger is now firing at the same intensity for a read receipt. That is not a small thing. It means your baseline state of alert is calibrated to something that costs you far more than it ever gives back. The moment of recognition arrives differently for everyone. For some, it comes all at once, after a particularly sharp disappointment. For others, it builds slowly through small observations that accumulate into something undeniable. But when it arrives, there is nothing subtle about the clarity. You have been operating from a place of scarcity, bargaining for attention and affection, while sitting on internal resources you kept hidden from yourself and from everyone around you. A senior leader once described this exact moment to me. For years, she had been the ideal employee. First in, last out, never turned down a project. But when promotions came around, she kept being passed over in favor of colleagues who seemed to do less, but moved through the world with more confidence. The realization did not come gradually. It hit without warning. Her constant availability had been read as an absence of personal ambition, as a signal that she had no agenda of her own worth respecting. Everything she had done out of dedication had been interpreted as proof that she had nowhere better to be. That understanding marks the beginning of a shift that goes much deeper than technique. This is not about putting on a new personality or running a script someone handed you. It is about finding your way back to your actual self, the version of you that existed before external expectations and social conditioning began reshaping everything. When you start moving from that place of authenticity, something changes at the root. Something shifts in how you move through the world. When the internal question changes, when you stop asking whether they approve and start asking whether this is actually aligned with what you are trying to build, the whole operating system runs differently. Other people feel that before you say a word about it. The path back to yourself requires real courage, because it means looking at uncomfortable truths without flinching. You will have to see how many times you betrayed your own values just to keep the peace. You will have to sit with how many opportunities you passed up out of fear of rejection. You will have to reckon with how much time and energy you poured into connections that drained you without offering anything real in return. But every one of those recognitions, as painful as they feel at first, moves you closer to something that actually deserves to be called freedom. There is a version of this shift that stays theoretical forever, something you understood once and lost by Thursday. The Complete Stoic System was built to close that gap, not by explaining the idea again, but by giving you the power of not reacting, the Stoic overthinking reset, and the Stoic daily practice as a working structure for the days when the pull is real and your grip on what you know starts to slip. The link is in the first pinned comment. Subscribers are getting a special rate right now. The real transformation begins when you start treating your time as the finite, irreplaceable resource it actually is. Every hour is gone the moment it passes. Every moment is a specific opportunity that will never exist again in that exact form. When that truth fully lands, your standards lift automatically. You stop scattering your time indiscriminately and start investing it deliberately in people and pursuits that genuinely feed your growth and your sense of self. This shift in orientation shows up in changes that seem small but run deep. You stop responding immediately to every message and allow yourself to reply with intention rather than reflex. You build defined windows for communication and free your mind from the relentless static of constant notifications. You learn to say, "Let me check my schedule," rather than committing impulsively to things that have no place in your actual life. These quiet adjustments carry a clear message. Your life has structure, it has direction, it has limits that exist to be respected, and people around you begin to register that without you needing to announce it. Managing your availability with genuine awareness is its own art form. The goal is not to seem cold or unreachable, but to create a structure that reflects your actual worth. When someone wants your time, you run it through a real filter. Does this align with where you are actually trying to go? Is there a real history of reciprocity? Does this serve both sides in a way that makes sense? That is not cold calculation. It is simply being conscious of a reality that has always been true. Your energy is not infinite, and spending it without thought has never been the generous act it was made out to be. In professional settings, this development becomes especially visible. Instead of being the person who absorbs every additional task without a word, you become someone who evaluates each request by what it actually contributes to your peak development. You start negotiating not just for salary, but for scope, and for the boundaries around your time that have never existed before. Your new stance is not confrontational, it is clear and professional. Colleagues and managers feel a shift in your presence, a groundedness that was not there before, a sense that you know exactly who you are and what your time is worth. This professional rebuild requires strategic patience. You cannot overhaul everything overnight without creating friction that works against you. Instead, you reshape your professional identity gradually. You start delegating the tasks you used to absorb automatically. You leave at a reasonable hour even when the inbox is still full, establishing a boundary around your time that communicates something without needing explanation. You communicate these shifts with firmness and professionalism, making clear that you are optimizing your real contribution rather than reducing it. Most managers respond well to this posture when it is carried with consistency and genuine competence behind it. Personal relationships go through a similar revolution. You stop being the unofficial emotional anchor for everyone around you, the person who always has time to listen but rarely finds an open ear when you need one yourself. You make reciprocity a non-negotiable principle rather than a preference you keep overlooking. When someone repeatedly cancels on you, you stop rescheduling. When a friendship has quietly become one-sided, when you are always the one making the reservation and sending the reminder, you allow it to dissolve on its own terms rather than sustaining it through sheer force of will. These shifts can feel stark at first. What they reveal is the actual quality of what you had been holding together. In romantic connections, the change runs even deeper. You let go of the mindset that drives so many failed relationships, the belief that you need to prove your value, to pursue approval, to reshape yourself into whatever you think the other person is looking for. Instead of running towards someone, you become someone worth running toward. Instead of performing a version of yourself designed to be accepted, you show who you actually are and let real compatibility determine what unfolds. This authenticity may produce fewer surface-level connections, but the ones it does produce are more honest, more durable, and with people who genuinely belong in your life. The key to this new dynamic is understanding that respect is never negotiated in words. It is built through consistent action over time. Every time you hold a limit, every time you put your own well-being first without apology, every time you respond with calm rather than reactivity, when the situation is trying to pull you under, you are sending a clear signal about your worth. That signal does far more than anything you could explain or argue out loud. It shows what you actually are, and what you show consistently becomes what others come to expect from you. Knowing when not to engage becomes one of the most underrated things you can develop. Not as a strategy designed to create an effect, but because some situations genuinely do not deserve the weight of your full response. When someone is disrespectful, the most honest thing you can do is not provide the reaction they were counting on. When a situation has turned genuinely corrosive, a quiet exit costs you nothing and communicates everything. The energy you stop spending on pointless friction is the same energy that becomes available for what actually belongs to you. Discipline becomes your most reliable ally in this process. Not discipline as self-punishment, but discipline as the structure that lets you stay aligned between what you value and how you actually live day to day. You build routines that feed your physical, emotional, and mental foundation. You invest time in things that make you more genuinely yourself, regardless of whether anyone else understands or appreciates the choice. That investment is not selfishness. It is responsibility to the most fundamental level of your life. The version of you that shows up depleted has nothing real to offer. Generosity that comes from emptiness is not generosity. It is a transaction disguised as a gift, and the people on the other end eventually feel that distinction, even when they cannot name it. Over time, you start noticing subtle but unmistakable shifts in how others respond to you. People who used to take you for granted begin paying more attention. The ones who would cancel last minute start confirming in advance. The ones who rarely initiated contact start showing up more often and with more genuine interest. These changes do not come from manipulation. They emerge from the natural human tendency to assign more value to what cannot be entirely predicted or controlled. You have become someone with a different quality of presence, and people respond to presence whether or not they understand what they are responding to. Your energy starts attracting different kinds of people into your life. Instead of the ones who were drawn to your limitless accommodation, you find yourself connecting with people who understand reciprocity, who treat mutual respect as the baseline rather than an achievement. These new connections feel different from everything you were used to before, more balanced, more honest, more sustainable. There is no constant drama to manage, no lopsided dynamic to compensate for, just a natural exchange that feeds both sides without exhausting either one. The quality of who you draw in improves steadily because your standards have risen and you are no longer willing to pretend otherwise. You no longer tolerate behavior you used to normalize. You no longer accept explanations you used to accept on behalf of people who were not treating you well. You no longer allow someone to cross a line you have clearly drawn without consequence. That firmness does not push people of genuine value away. It pulls them toward you. People who operate with integrity are drawn to those who do the same because they recognize how rare it is and how much easier everything becomes when both people in a connection are actually being real. The emotional independence you are building does not make you cold or distant. It actually allows you to love and give from a place of genuine fullness rather than need. When your emotional footing is no longer contingent on constant approval, you can offer warmth without hidden conditions attached. That freedom is quietly magnetic. People feel the difference between someone who is genuinely settled and someone still bargaining for their own sense of okay. That difference is not communicated through what you say. It comes through in how much you seem to need the conversation to go a certain way. The fear of being left behind, which once shaped so many of your choices, gradually transforms into a deep trust in your own ability to thrive, regardless of what others decide. That trust is not arrogance, it is confidence built from actual lived experience. You have learned to sit comfortably with yourself, to genuinely enjoy your own company, to build a full life that does not depend on any particular person's presence or absence. When someone chooses to stay, that is a welcome addition. It is not a desperate necessity. And that shift in how you hold that question changes everything about the quality of what you allow into your life. Patience becomes one of your most distinctive qualities over time. Not the passive waiting that hopes things will change on their own, but the active patience that allows things to unfold at their real pace without you trying to force the outcome. You stop trying to push relationships in directions they are not naturally moving. You stop trying to control variables that were never yours to manage in the first place. This quality of ease makes you more compelling to be around, not less, because people sense the complete absence of pressure or hidden agenda in every interaction you have with them. Your communication becomes more effective precisely because you have learned to say less. Every word carries weight and intention because you no longer fill space for the sake of filling it. You no longer feel the pull to fill uncomfortable silence with words that do not need to exist. You do not over-explain your decisions or justify your choices at length to people who have not earned that level of access. This economy of language communicates something about you before you have said anything of substance. People begin listening more carefully when you do speak, because they have learned that what you say actually carries meaning with the opinions of others gradually lose the grip they once had on you. Not because you become hard or indifferent, but because you have built solid internal reference points for measuring your own progress. Other people's assessments remain interesting information, but they are no longer the verdict on who you are. This freedom from external judgment allows you to take risks you would have avoided before, to explore directions that felt too exposed, to express your authentic self without the constant filtering that used to limit everything you could reach for. The part nobody mentions is that understanding this does not make the next provocation easier to navigate. The next time the situation presents itself, you will be working from memory of something you heard, not from a practiced response. The Complete Stoic System exists for exactly that gap, the power of not reacting for the moment itself, the Stoic overthinking. Reset for the spiral that follows, and the Stoic daily practice to build the habit before the next test arrives. The link is in the first pinned comment. That offer runs for a limited time only. Setbacks stop being the thing that defeats you and start being the thing that sharpens you. When you encounter rejection, disappointment, or conflict, your emotional world no longer fractures around it. You have developed the resilience to move through these experiences, extract what is genuinely useful from them, and continue without carrying resentment or a victim story that keeps the wound open longer than it needs to be. That emotional steadiness becomes visible to others, who find themselves drawn to your stability in a landscape full of people who fall apart under ordinary pressure. Your physical presence begins to shift in ways that are subtle but registered by everyone around you. In a meeting, you no longer wait to be invited into the conversation. You speak when you have something real to contribute. Your posture carries more certainty. Your attention is more direct. You are no longer scanning the room for reassurance, because what you need is not coming from the room anymore. That quality of presence registers before anyone has processed it consciously. People do not think to themselves that you seem settled. They just find themselves paying more attention to what you do next and trusting it more when it arrives. The choices you make grow increasingly aligned with what you actually value, rather than being driven by fear or the desire to avoid disapproval. This internal consistency creates a quality that others can feel before they can name it. Your life becomes a genuine expression of who you are, not a performance staged for an audience. That authenticity lands in a way that no amount of strategic impression management ever could. When this kind of clarity speaks to you, follow the channel so it keeps finding you. At the bottom of all of this, you will eventually understand that it was never really about getting others to see you as a priority. It was always about making yourself your own first priority. When you live from that place of genuine self-respect, the outer world simply reflects it back. The people who are actually suited to your energy find their way in on their own terms. The ones who are not move out of the picture without drama, without grievance, without any need for a final conversation. This last understanding does not mark the end of the path. It marks the beginning of a different phase, one where you live from enough internal abundance that you no longer need the world to confirm what you already know about yourself. Someone who holds your own value at the deepest level, and in doing so quietly calls that same quality to the surface in everyone who crosses your path, not because you announced it, because you stopped acting otherwise. Adversity stops being the thing that breaks the rhythm and starts being the thing that deepens it. The foundation you have built does not shift with circumstances. Challenges that would have paralyzed you before You now move through with a quiet steadiness that others can feel even when they cannot explain what they are sensing. This is not a performance of calm. It is what calm actually looks like when it has been genuinely built from the inside out. Your relationship to what you own and what you pursue materially shifts as well. The urgency to acquire proof of worth from outside yourself loses its pull. Decisions become more deliberate, aimed at real value, rather than the management of how you appear. This, paradoxically, tends to produce more sustainable results across every area of life, because choices made from a place of actual clarity generate outcomes that last longer than choices made to fill something that cannot be filled from the outside. How you handle conflict transforms. Instead of avoiding it from fear or exploding from accumulated pressure, you learn to address what needs to be addressed with precision and an absence of drama. You can name what you need and where you draw the line without treating the other person as an enemy. You can hear a perspective that challenges yours without feeling that your identity is being attacked. That capacity to engage with difficulty cleanly is one of the rarest and most valuable things a person can develop, and it strengthens every connection it touches. Your capacity for creative work and genuine output comes alive in a new way. When you are no longer spending enormous amounts of mental energy managing other people's approval or navigating relationships built on imbalance, that energy becomes available for things that actually belong to you. Work you kept putting aside finally receives the attention it deserves. Ideas that had been suppressed by anxiety and self-doubt start moving again. What you arrive at after this process does not look like the absence of anything. It looks like having enough internal weight that outside turbulence stops reorganizing everything. You are not numb. You are not removed. You are simply no longer available to be destabilized by things that were never worth that much of you to begin with. That groundedness extends outward in ways you do not have to manage. It is simply there, in how you enter a room, in how you respond, in what you let pass without comment. If you want a concrete structure for everything you have just heard, the Complete Stoic System is in the first pinned comment. The power of not reacting, the Stoic overthinking reset, and the Stoic daily practice, all in one place. And one day, without ceremony or announcement, you will wake up and find that you are simply no longer the person who was reaching for approval, absorbing disrespect, or shrinking to make someone else comfortable. None of it will feel like a dramatic transformation. It will feel like noticing that the old pull was there, and you just did not follow it. That is the only signal that actually matters, and it is quieter than you expected, and more permanent than anything loud ever could have been. There is something worth sitting with a little longer about the specific mechanics of how this shift happens in real time, because understanding the theory is not the same as knowing what it looks like on a Tuesday morning when someone you work with tries to pull you back into an old pattern. The old version of you had an automatic response already loaded. The reflexive yes, the immediate over-explanation, the fast apology for something that did not require one. The response that was chosen not by you but by the conditioning you were handed years before the situation even arose. The new version of you pauses. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else would even notice, just long enough for a completely different question to arrive. Not what do they need from me right now, but what is actually true for me in this moment. That tiny gap between stimulus and response is where everything changes. It is where you stop being a function of other people's expectations and start being a function of your own actual values. That gap does not appear overnight. You build it, you practice it, you lose it under pressure and find it again, and gradually it becomes wide enough to live in. The relationships that survive this shift are often surprising. Some people you expected to stay do not, because what they wanted was access to someone who would not hold ground. And some connections you assumed were shallow turn out to have real roots, because the other person actually respects the change, even if they cannot fully articulate why. The landscape of your social world reorganizes itself around who you have actually become, rather than who you were convenient to have around. There is also something that happens to the way you listen when you stop needing every conversation to go a certain way. When you are no longer monitoring for approval signals, when you are not mentally calculating how you are being received while someone is speaking to you, you actually hear them. Real listening is one of the rarest things a person can offer another, and when you develop it, people feel it in a way that is completely distinct from the performed attentiveness that was all you had when most of your attention was tied up in managing your own anxiety. Your sense of humor shifts as well. When you are less defended, less invested in being perceived a specific way, genuinely funnier things tend to come out of you because you are not running a filter over every potential response before it leaves your mouth. Lightness is a natural byproduct of not carrying the weight of other people's opinions everywhere you go. You become easier to be around in a way that has nothing to do with accommodation and everything to do with actually being present. The work of building this version of yourself is not linear. There will be weeks where everything holds, and weeks where old patterns surface, under specific kinds of pressure, usually the ones that have the longest roots, a dynamic with a parent, a situation that echoes something from years before, a relationship where the conditioning runs especially deep. These are not evidence that the work has failed. They are exactly where the work is still happening. The point is not to become someone who never gets pulled. It is to become someone who recognizes the pull faster, recovers quicker, and no longer builds an entire identity around her, trying to prevent it from happening at all. Other people become your teachers in this process in a way they never were before. The person who pushes against your new limits is showing you exactly where those limits needed to be stated more clearly. The person who responds to your new groundedness with distance is showing you what that connection was actually built on. The person who responds with more genuine warmth than you expected is showing you something real about what becomes possible when you stop making yourself small. Everyone is information when you are actually paying attention. Your inner voice becomes more useful, not louder in the anxious sense, but more reliable. Less contaminated by what you think others want to hear from you, it starts giving you accurate readings of situations you used to misread, people you used to misread, and your own state, which for a long time you were too defended to accurately assess. You start trusting that voice in small things and then in larger things, and over time it becomes one of the most valuable navigational tools you have. Sleep changes. The quality of your rest shifts when you are not running background processing all night on unresolved situations you were afraid to address directly. The body has a way of holding what the mind refuses to confront, and when the mind starts confronting things directly, the body gets to put some of that weight down. You wake up with more access to yourself than you had the night before. That might sound like a small thing. It is not a small thing. The version of you that emerges from this process is not an idealized self. It is not a self without flaws or difficulty or days when everything feels hard. It is simply a self that you have actually chosen, built through decisions made in the direction of your real values rather than away from your real fears. That is the whole difference, and it turns out to be an enormous one. Every situation that asks something of you now asks something of a person with an actual center, not someone performing strength while quietly terrified, but someone whose actions come from the same place as their stated values. That alignment is what integrity actually means, underneath all the ways the word gets used carelessly. It means the inside and the outside are pointing in the same direction. And people feel it the moment they are in the room with you, even when they could not tell you exactly what they are feeling. This is what it means to become a person who does not need to demand respect because they carry it naturally, not loudly, not in a way that requires constant maintenance or an audience to validate. Just present the way certain things are simply present, like the feeling in a room when someone who is genuinely at peace with themselves walks into it. That is not the end of the story. It never is. But it is a different chapter, and if you have made it to this point, you already know what the next one requires of you. There is one more thing worth naming directly, because it tends to get overlooked in favor of the more dramatic parts of this kind of change. The people who go through this transformation often underestimate how much they needed to give themselves permission. Permission to take up space, permission to need things, permission to let something end when it has genuinely run its course, rather than heroically sustaining it past the point where it was serving anyone. That permission is not granted by anyone outside you. It never was. Waiting for it from somewhere else is part of the original problem. The moment you stop waiting and simply act from it, something in the quality of your entire life begins to shift.